There is a place in southern Africa where the land does not forgive, where the grass turns the color of old bone, and the sky presses down like a lid on everything beneath it, where distances are not measured in kilometers but in days, and where the things that want to eat you are not abstract dangers but real, breathing, watching presences just beyond the line of sight. Botswana. The Kalahari Basin, the Okavango, the salt pans of the Makgadikgadi, stretching out so flat and so white that the horizon seems to curve away from you in every direction at once. This is a country that does not accommodate human weakness. It absorbs it, quietly, completely. And this is where Marcus Tanner chose to run. Not a marathon, not a road race with aid stations every 5 kilometers and volunteers handing out electrolyte drinks in paper cups. Something far older than that. Something that had no official distance, no registration number, no timing chip. A solo crossing of one of the most remote and wildlife-dense wilderness corridors on the African continent. Nearly 300 kilometers of it, on foot, moving through terrain that has no roads, no mobile signal, no emergency services, and no particular interest in whether a single human being makes it out the other side. Marcus had done difficult things before. He had run across deserts. He had finished races in conditions that sent other competitors to hospital tents. He had learned, through years of accumulated punishment, how to keep moving when the body insists on stopping. He believed, with the particular confidence of someone who has survived many hard things, that he understood the outer limits of what running through wild places could ask of him. He was wrong, because none of his previous experience had included a leopard. At night, alone on a dry riverbed, with no phone and no road back. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. To understand what happened in that riverbed, you first need to understand the landscape that produced it, and you need to understand the man who chose to enter it. If you want to see where this story goes, stay with us. And if stories like this are what you come here for, make sure you subscribe right now so you never miss one. This is the kind of thing we live for. Let us start with the land itself. Botswana is landlocked. It sits in the center of southern Africa, surrounded by Namibia to the west, Zimbabwe to the northeast, South Africa to the south, and Zambia catching just a corner in the north. It is a large country, and a quiet one. It has one of the lowest population densities on Earth. Much of its interior is given over to wildlife, to protected areas, to wilderness that has been deliberately kept wild. The government decided, many decades ago, that the animals and the ecosystems they inhabit were worth more intact than exploited. And so vast corridors of land were preserved, not as parks in the manicured sense, but as functioning wilderness, where predator and prey still operate in the ancient relationship of pursuit and escape. The Chobe region in the north holds some of the highest concentrations of elephant on the continent. 40, 50, 60,000 individuals moving through the floodplains and mopane woodlands, reshaping the landscape as they go. Buffalo herds thousands strong. Lion prides that have learned to take buffalo as their primary prey, developing cooperative hunting strategies of extraordinary complexity. Wild dog packs ranging over territories so vast that tracking them requires aircraft. And leopards. Everywhere leopards, silent, solitary, enormously adaptable, and as comfortable moving through darkness as they are in daylight. Leopards occupy every available habitat in Botswana, from the dense riverine forest along the Linyanti to the open scrubland of the Kalahari Edge. They have been recorded at waterholes, on rocky outcrops, in the crowns of enormous fig trees, on the rooftops of research camps, and on the sandy beds of seasonal rivers, where they walk with their particular rolling, low-slung gait, leaving tracks that look almost casual, but belong to something entirely precise. They are not common sightings. They are not animals that announce themselves. Most people who spend years in the bush see leopards only a handful of times, and usually only because the leopard has decided, for reasons of its own, to allow itself to be seen. The rest of the time it is simply there, close and invisible, its spotted coat dissolving into the dappled light and shadow of the vegetation around it. This was the landscape Marcus was planning to move through, and he was planning to move through it alone, which was the part that most of the people who knew him found impossible to fully accept. Marcus had been thinking about Botswana for 3 years before he actually went. The idea had begun the way these ideas often do, not with a plan, but with a feeling. He had been reading about the early explorers who moved on foot through Central and Southern Africa in the 19th century. Men like David Livingstone, who covered extraordinary distances under extraordinary hardship, sustained by nothing more than determination and the logistical ingenuity of the people he traveled with. What struck Marcus was not the heroism of those accounts, but the intimacy of them, the way those men described being inside a landscape rather than passing through it, the way walking and running, moving at human pace, meant you encountered the world at its own scale, rather than from behind glass, or above it, in the thin air of a light aircraft. Marcus was 41 years old at the time he began planning the crossing. He had been running since his early 20s, when a period of serious personal difficulty had led him to the trails above his home in the Welsh Hills, and he had discovered that moving through landscape at sustained effort did something to the mind that nothing else replicated. It clarified things. It reduced complicated situations to their component parts. When you are managing pain and distance and navigation simultaneously, there is no mental space left for the ordinary anxieties that consume most human beings most of the time. Running long distances in wild places was not, for Marcus, a hobby or a competitive pursuit. It was closer to a practice, a discipline in the old sense, something he returned to because it reliably produced a version of himself that he preferred. He had run across the Namib. He had done a self-supported crossing of a large section of the Atlas Mountains in Morocco. He had completed several well-known multi-day races in mountain environments. He knew heat. He knew cold. He knew what it meant to wake before dawn on the third consecutive day of effort and feel the full weight of accumulated fatigue and choose to move anyway. What he had not done was move through landscape where the large predators were not managed, not habituated to humans, and not separated from him by any kind of barrier or guide. The distinction matters enormously. There is a category difference between running through remote mountains, where the worst thing that can happen is a twisted ankle or a deteriorating weather system, and running through an African wilderness, where there are animals large enough to kill you quickly and efficiently, and that have not been conditioned to regard humans as anything other than a potential food source or a potential threat. In the mountains, the landscape is the danger. In the African bush, the landscape contains the danger within it, distributed invisibly across the terrain, potentially behind any tree, in any patch of long grass, on any rocky shelf above any dry riverbed. Marcus understood this intellectually. He had done significant research. He had spoken to wildlife biologists, to guides who had spent decades in the bush, to researchers who worked with large carnivore populations. He had read everything available about leopard behavior, lion behavior, elephant behavior, hippo behavior. He had learned about the specific dangers of each, the contexts in which they became dangerous, the signals they gave, the distances at which different species typically made the decision to charge or retreat. He had assembled a kit that was the result of months of careful thought. No phone, because he was entering areas with no signal, and dead weight is dead weight when you are running 300 kilometers. A satellite communicator for genuine emergencies, water treatment capability, enough food for the planned 6-day crossing with a small margin, a headlamp and backup lighting, a knife, a whistle, a small flare, a compact first aid kit, a detailed paper map of the corridor he intended to run, annotated with the water sources he had confirmed were likely to be active at this time of year. He had not carried a firearm. He had considered it and decided against it, for reasons that were partly practical and partly philosophical. Practically, a firearm in the hands of someone who encounters a charging animal at close range and low visibility is unlikely to be deployed effectively. It can make you feel safer without actually making you safer, and that false confidence is itself a danger. Philosophically, he was entering a place on the land's own terms. He wanted to feel what the landscape actually was, not move through it behind the psychological barrier of a weapon. He had told exactly 3 people where he was going. He had left a detailed itinerary with a contact who would raise an alarm if he failed to check in via the satellite communicator at the agreed times. He had done everything that a careful, experienced person can do to mitigate the risks of such an undertaking. And then on a morning in late June, before the sun had fully risen, he stepped away from the dirt track where the driver who had dropped him off was turning his vehicle around and walked into the bush. The first day was extraordinary, in the way that first days of long journeys always are. The body is fresh and the mind is still calibrating, still adjusting to the reality of what has begun. The landscape came at him in waves of detail, the quality of the light in the early morning, golden and low, catching the tops of the termite mounds and the seed heads of the tall grasses, and the pale gray bark of the leadwood trees. The sound of the bush waking up, Francolin calling from dense cover, a pair of ground hornbills moving through the grass with slow, deliberate steps, their red facial skin vivid against the muted palette of the dry season. A small herd of impala that flowed away from him in a single liquid movement, their alarm snorts punching through the morning air and fading. He was running at a conservative pace. He had planned the daily distances carefully. Not so far that he would exhaust himself on the early days and lose the capacity to respond to difficulty later, but far enough that the total crossing was achievable within the time window he had. 50 kilometers on the first day, 45 on the second and third, 50 on the fourth, then a shorter day 5 depending on conditions, and a final push to the endpoint on day 6. The terrain was mixed. Open grassland gave way to dense mopane woodland, where the trees grew close together, and the ground was carpeted in fallen leaves that crunched underfoot. Dry riverbeds crossed his route regularly, their sandy floors soft and tiring to run on, but offering open sightlines and cooler air that pooled in the low ground. He followed these channels when they ran in the right direction, grateful for the visibility they offered. On the afternoon of the first day, he found elephant sign, fresh dung, still steaming slightly in the cool air, broken branches, a set of tracks in the sand of a dry channel that were absurdly large, each footpad wider than his own 2 feet, placed side by side. He altered course slightly to give the animals distance and moved quickly through the area, making just enough noise with his movement to announce his presence without startling anything at close range. He heard them before he saw them. The deep rumbling communication that elephants use, felt as much as heard, a sub-bass vibration in the chest that is difficult to describe to anyone who has not experienced it. 3 of them, cows with calves, moving through the mopane woodland perhaps 200 meters to his east. He stopped, watched, let them move. When they had gone, he resumed his pace. He reached his first camp just before the light failed, a low rocky shelf beside a dry waterhole that offered some elevation and a natural wall to his back. He had eaten while running during the afternoon, carrying dense caloric food that required no preparation. He drank treated water from his filter system and lay down under an open sky that filled steadily with stars as the last light drained from the west. He did not sleep well. This was expected. The first night in the bush is always the most difficult because the sounds are new. Every rustle, every footstep, every distant calling animal registers as a potential threat until the mind has cataloged enough sounds to know which ones matter and which ones are simply the ambient noise of a living landscape going about its business. He lay still and listened and identified what he could. Jackals in the distance, a nightjar somewhere close, its churring call cycling on and off. Something larger moving through the mopane to the north, probably a kudu, given the deliberate, careful quality of its footsteps. He slept eventually, in patches. The second day brought heat. The dry season in Botswana delivers cold nights and warm days, but by mid-morning the temperature was climbing into the high 30s, and the sun was absolute and without mercy. He ran through it carefully, managing his water consumption against the distances between the water sources marked on his map. The first source was dry, a shallow pan that had held water early in the season, but had been drunk down by animals and evaporated by the sun until nothing remained but a cracked gray surface and the concentrated tracks of every species in the area, converging on the point where the water had been. He had planned for this contingency. The next confirmed source was 12 kilometers further. He had enough water to cover it. He recalculated, adjusted his pace, moved on. The wildlife on the second day was extraordinary. He passed within 150 meters of a sleeping pride of lions in the shade of an enormous cluster of buffalo thorn trees. He saw them first and stopped immediately. 5 females and several cubs. One of the females raised her head and looked at him for a long moment with the flat, unhurried gaze of an animal at the top of its hierarchy. Then she put her head back down. He gave them an enormous margin, a long detour through difficult terrain that cost him time and energy, and when he was clear of them, he felt the adrenaline working through him, a chemical brightness that sharpened everything. He found the second waterhole intact. Standing water, dark and slightly brackish, crowded with the tracks of everything that had drunk there in the past 24 hours. He treated the water carefully and drank until he felt the hydration settling into him, refilled his bottles, moved on. The second night he slept better. The sounds were beginning to make sense. His mind was filing them correctly. On the morning of the third day, something changed. He had been running for about an hour when he became aware that he was being watched. It was not a visual cue. He had not seen anything. It was something more primitive than sight, a prickling awareness, a heightened state of alertness that the body produces when some sensory input below the level of conscious processing has registered something that the conscious mind has not yet caught up with. He stopped running, turned slowly, scanned the bush around him. Nothing visible. He stood still for 3 minutes. The birds were quiet. That was significant. The ambient bird call that formed the background texture of movement through the bush had faded. When birds go quiet, something is close that is not supposed to be there. He moved on, but carefully, at a walk, his senses fully extended. The feeling persisted for perhaps 2 kilometers, and then gradually faded as the bird call resumed and the ordinary business of the bush reasserted itself. He did not know what had been watching him. He had theories. He filed it as a data point and kept moving. The third day covered difficult ground, a section of densely vegetated floodplain where the vegetation was chest-high in places and visibility dropped to almost nothing. He moved through it as quickly as he could, making enough noise to avoid surprising anything, alert for the particular stillness that precedes a hippo on land, for the sound of something large beginning to move in the green tangle around him. He got through it without incident, but it cost him energy and time, and left him with a specific kind of tiredness that comes not from physical effort alone, but from sustained high-level alertness. His body was in good condition. His feet were holding. He had managed a small blister on the right heel on the first day, and treated it immediately before it could develop into something serious. His caloric intake was slightly below target because the effort of navigating difficult terrain had suppressed his appetite, but he was compensating by eating whenever he stopped, regardless of whether he felt hungry. He reached his third camp in good time. The map showed a dry watercourse nearby, and he made his way to it. It was a beautiful thing. A wide sandy channel, maybe 60 meters across, bone dry, the sand pale silver in the late afternoon light, flanked on both sides by large trees that overhung the banks and made a kind of natural corridor. The sand held tracks in extraordinary density. This was a highway for everything in the area. Elephant tracks, enormous and overlapping. Lion tracks, round and large as dinner plates. The pointed prints of kudu and impala. The smaller signatures of jackals and honey badgers and jennets, and all the smaller inhabitants of the system. And one set of tracks that Marcus recognized immediately and stopped to study. Leopard, fresh. The tracks moved along the middle of the channel, confident and unhurried, each one perfectly defined in the fine sand. The animal had been here within the last few hours. The tracks were moving in the same direction he was traveling. He noted it, adjusted his mental map, set up his camp on the high bank above the channel, where the elevation gave him marginally better sight lines. 8. Lay down as the darkness came on. He slept. He had been tired enough to sleep despite everything, and the exhaustion of the previous days had built to a point where his body simply demanded it. He woke at some point in the deep night. No idea of the hour. The stars were overhead in the specific configuration they take on in the hours before dawn, when the sky has rotated and the familiar patterns have shifted from where they were when he fell asleep. He did not know immediately what had woken him. He lay completely still and listened. Silence, but a different quality of silence than the ordinary silence of the bush. Something concentrated about it, something present in it. And then he heard the sound. It is difficult to describe a leopard's sawing cough to someone who has never heard it. It is described in field guides as a rasping sound, repetitive, like the noise of coarse wood being sawed. That description is accurate as far as it goes, but it does not capture the quality of it in person, at night, in the dark, when you are alone, and there is no road, and no phone, and no other human being within many kilometers. What it captures in person is not just its acoustic character, but its proximity. The way sound travels at night in still air, the way you understand, instantly and completely, that the animal producing this sound is not far away. Marcus lay still. He made a decision in that moment that he would describe later as the most important decision of the entire crossing. He did not move. He did not scramble for the flare or the knife or the whistle. He did not make any sudden sound or movement that might register as the behavior of prey. He simply lay as still as he had ever lain in his life, and breathed as slowly as he could manage and waited. The call came again, a little closer, or perhaps the same distance and simply louder in the still air. He could not be certain. He placed the direction of it. Somewhere in the channel below the bank where he lay, perhaps 50 meters, perhaps less. He was elevated above the channel floor by perhaps 2 meters. He was on his back against the natural wall of the bank, in the shadow of a large tree. He was not in the channel. The leopard was. He understood, in the precise and clarified way that extreme situations clarify understanding, several things simultaneously. A leopard does not hunt by sound alone. It hunts by sight, and by smell, and by the extraordinary sensitivity of its hearing. He was upwind of the animal's direction of travel based on the faint movement of air he had noted before sleeping. He was in shadow, and against a dark background. He was still. He was, in other words, doing the closest thing to invisible that he could manage. He was also aware that leopards are exceptional climbers, and that a 2-meter bank presented no obstacle whatsoever to an animal capable of dragging a kill, weighing twice its own body weight, 20 meters up a vertical tree trunk. He did not think about this for long. The sawing call moved. He tracked it by ear. It was moving along the channel below him, continuing in the direction of travel, parallel to his position, and then past it. He heard it for perhaps 8 more minutes, measured, unhurried, the sound of an animal engaged in its own business, not in pursuit, not alarmed, not fixed on anything. And then it was gone. He lay still for another 20 minutes after the last sound. Then he sat up slowly and looked out over the channel in the darkness. Nothing visible. The stars overhead, the pale sand below, just visible as a lighter band against the dark vegetation on the far bank. He did not sleep again that night. He lay still and watched the darkness and waited for the dawn, and when it came, gray and then pink, and then the sudden full gold of African morning, he climbed down into the channel and looked for the tracks. They were there, moving along the channel in the direction he had judged. At the point where they would have passed closest to his position on the bank, he measured the distance with his eye. 30 meters, perhaps a little more, perhaps not. The tracks were large, a big male, based on the size of the prints. An adult animal in prime condition, the definition of each pad crisp and clear in the fine sand. He followed them with his eye, for as far as he could see. They continued down the channel and around a bend and out of sight. He stood there for a long time. Then he ate breakfast, packed his camp, and continued running. What followed on the 4th day was in some ways the most demanding day of the crossing, not because of any single dramatic event, but because of the accumulated weight of the experience. The encounter with the leopard had not frightened him in any simple way. Fear is too crude a word for what he had felt in those hours lying on the bank. Something more complex, a recognition of his actual position in this landscape. The bush does not present itself as neutral ground. It is not a backdrop for human endeavor. It is a living system with its own priorities. And human beings occupy a very specific and not particularly elevated position within it. The leopard had not been hunting him. The leopard had been going about its night in a landscape it owned. Marcus had been present in that landscape as a temporary and largely inconsequential element. That is a difficult thing to feel. Intellectually, Marcus had known it before he arrived. Emotionally, lying in the dark, listening to the sawing call moving through the darkness below him, he understood it in a way that went considerably deeper than intellectual knowledge. He ran the 4th day in a different state than the previous days, more awake to the landscape, less confident in his own centrality to it, more genuinely curious about what was sharing the terrain with him, not as a background fact, but as the primary reality of the place. He saw things on the 4th day that he had been moving too quickly through his own internal narrative to properly notice on the earlier days. A pair of bat-eared foxes sitting outside their burrow in the early morning, ears swiveling independently like satellite dishes, tracking sounds from multiple directions simultaneously. A martial eagle on a dead tree, impossibly regal, watching the grassland below it with the particular focused patience of a hunter with no need to hurry. A pangolin, of all things, moving in its peculiar shuffling armored walk across a patch of bare ground, ancient and improbable, looking like something a medieval illustrator might have invented as a joke. He stopped for the pangolin, stood very still and watched it until it disappeared into the grass. He felt, in that moment, the particular emotion that comes from seeing something that does not expect to be seen, something going about its life in a landscape that belongs to it entirely. The water on the 4th day was good. 2 sources marked on his map proved active, both with recent wildlife activity that confirmed their reliability. He drank deeply at each, ate while he refilled his bottles, kept moving. His body was beginning to accumulate its debt. The calves were tight in the evenings. The right Achilles was making its discomfort known in the first kilometers of each morning before warming through. His hands had swollen slightly in the way that happens after multiple days of sustained effort. None of these were serious problems. All of them were expected. He managed them with the practiced attention of someone who had run long enough to know the difference between the signals that require action and the signals that simply require acknowledgement. The fourth night he heard lions, distant but unmistakable, the deep resonant call that carries extraordinary distances in still air. A male advertising his territory, the sound dropping and rising in that particular phrasing that is like nothing else in the natural world. He listened to it from his camp, lying on his back and looking at the stars, and felt something that was impossible to articulate precisely, but had the quality of being located correctly, of being in the right place, of being for the first time in a long time, fully present in a situation that had no room for anything other than itself. On the morning of the fifth day, he was 35 kilometers from the endpoint. He had planned this day as a shorter one, a rest and consolidation before the final push on day 6, but he woke early, before the light, with a clarity about what he wanted to do. He wanted to finish, not because he was exhausted or frightened or ready to leave, but because the crossing was a complete thing, and he could feel its completeness approaching, and he wanted to move toward it. He broke camp in the dark, ate while he walked out of camp to warm up slowly, and began running as the first gray light spread across the eastern sky. The terrain on the fifth day was the most beautiful he had seen. A section of the route that moved along the edge of a large floodplain, the grass in the floodplain long and golden and moving in the slight breeze that came with the dawn. A herd of red lechwe in the middle distance, the male's horns catching the early light, wattled cranes moving through the tall grass with their improbable dignity. A fish eagle calling from a dead tree at the edge of a channel, its cry going up over everything and hanging in the air. He ran through it and felt something that running very long distances in very wild places occasionally produces, and that is almost impossible to describe to someone who has not experienced it. A state in which the boundary between the body running and the landscape it is running through becomes genuinely unclear. Not a mystical state, not an absence of self, but a quality of integration so complete that the effort and the terrain and the light and the sound are all a single thing happening at once. He had felt it before, only in certain conditions. Long days, sufficient accumulated fatigue, landscape of sufficient richness. It does not last. It comes and goes in waves, but when it is present, it is the thing that all of it is for. He ran 35 kilometers without stopping for anything other than water. He reached the endpoint in the late afternoon of the fifth day, a track junction marked on his map where a dirt road crossed a dry riverbed. He stood there and looked at the road in both directions and thought about what had just happened. 5 days, just under 270 kilometers. The Kalahari and the Okavango corridors, and the dry riverbeds, and the leopard in the darkness, and the lions calling across the night, and the pangolin moving through its ancient day, and the elephants rumbling in the mopane woodland, and all of it, done at the pace of running feet on ground. He sat down on the sand at the edge of the road and drank the last of his water and ate the last of his food and waited for the vehicle that was coming to meet him, arranged in advance for this point. He did not feel triumphant. He felt something quieter than that, something that did not have a commonly used name in the vocabulary available to him. The closest he could come to it was simply, he had been there. He had moved through that landscape as a participant in it, rather than an observer of it. He had been present in a world where the normal human insulation from the actual conditions of existence had been stripped away, and what remained was something both simpler and larger than ordinary life. The vehicle arrived 2 hours later. The driver climbed out and looked at Marcus, and said nothing for a moment. Then he asked if everything had gone all right. Marcus thought about the leopard tracks in the sand, and the dark hours on the bank above the channel, and the sawing call moving through the darkness below him. He said yes, everything had gone all right. Now let us talk about what this kind of undertaking actually involves beneath the surface of the story. Because Marcus's crossing was extraordinary, but the principles that made it possible and the things that nearly ended it are things that illuminate something important about the relationship between human beings and wild places. The first thing to understand is what happens to human perception in sustained wilderness. When you are in wild landscape for multiple days with no access to digital mediation of any kind, no phone, no music, no news, no social media, nothing between you and the raw information of the place you are moving through, something shifts in the way the senses operate. This is not metaphor, it is something measurable. Research conducted with people who have spent extended periods in wilderness without technology has found demonstrable changes in attentional function, in the capacity to process sensory information, in the quality of problem solving. The brain, freed from the chronic low-grade overstimulation of the digital environment, recalibrates toward the inputs that are actually present. For Marcus, this meant that by the third day, he was noticing things he would not have noticed on the first day. The quality of the bird calls around him had become a meaningful data stream rather than background noise. He could read the behavior of animals at a distance in a way that was unavailable to him when he arrived. The sand in the riverbeds told him things about what had moved through recently and from which direction. The smell of the air carried information about water, about animals, about vegetation type. He was not becoming something other than human. He was becoming more fully human in the sense of using capacities that evolution built into human beings over millions of years of living in direct relationship with wild landscape. This is what is lost when we remove ourselves from wild places entirely. Not a romantic abstraction, but a functional capability, a suite of perceptual and cognitive capacities that were shaped by and for exactly the kind of environment Marcus was moving through. The second thing to understand is the specific nature of leopard danger and why Marcus's response to what he heard in the riverbed was, from the perspective of animal behavior, exactly correct. Leopards are ambush predators. Their hunting strategy is based on concealment, patience, and a final explosive burst of speed and power at very close range. What they are not is pursuit predators. They do not run down prey over distance the way lions and wild dogs do. A leopard that is detected before it can initiate its ambush sequence faces a fundamental tactical problem. The element of concealment that its entire strategy depends on has been removed, and a leopard that knows it has been detected will, in the vast majority of encounters, simply disengage. It will move away and find another situation in which its advantages are intact. Marcus, by lying completely still on the elevated bank above the channel, had presented the leopard with a set of circumstances in which it was not triggered to hunt. He was not moving. He was not making sounds associated with prey animals in distress. He was not presenting himself as an easy opportunity. He was simply a still, large, warm shape in the darkness above the channel, and the leopard, engaged in its own business, had no particular interest in investigating it. Had he panicked? Had he scrambled to his feet and run? Had he made sudden large movements? He would have presented a very different stimulus. The instinct of a leopard is calibrated to respond to movement, to the sudden activity of something attempting to flee. There are documented accounts of leopard attacks on humans that were triggered by exactly this kind of involuntary response to the shock of an unexpected close encounter. The stillness that Marcus maintained was not bravery in the conventional sense. It was not the absence of fear. He has described what he felt in those hours as among the most intense physical sensations of his life, the chemical reality of extreme alertness, every system in his body screaming at him to move. The choice to remain still was a muscular act of will against the full weight of his own nervous system's emergency signaling. Third, the question of the satellite communicator and what it meant for the ethics of the undertaking. There is an ongoing debate in the community of people who move through wild places about the role of emergency communication technology. On one side is the argument that having the ability to call for help removes the existential stakes that give wilderness experience its transformative quality. That the freedom from ordinary consequence is part of what wild places have to offer, and that carrying a device that can summon rescue undermines the authentic relationship with risk that these environments are supposed to produce. On the other side is the argument that dying unnecessarily accomplishes nothing, that the obligation to people who care about you is a legitimate ethical constraint on the risks you take, and that the presence of an emergency communicator does not meaningfully alter the lived experience of moving through wilderness, since in the vast majority of situations it will never be used. Marcus had come down firmly on the second side of this argument, and his reasons were thoughtful. He was not alone in the world. He had people who depended on his return. The crossing was not a death wish. It was a deliberate exploration of the outer edge of his capacity, and carrying a device that could in a genuine emergency summon help did not make the experience false. What would make the experience false was using it unnecessarily, allowing it to become a psychological crutch that altered his relationship to the real conditions around him. He had resolved before he left that the communicator was for situations in which not using it would result in death, nothing short of that. He had checked in at each agreed time. He had never come close to activating the emergency function, but carrying it had not made the crossing easier in any meaningful sense. The Leopard did not care about the satellite communicator. The lions did not care about the satellite communicator. The landscape did not care about the satellite communicator. He had still been required to navigate, to manage water, to read the bush, to make the decision on that bank in the darkness, using only the knowledge and the nerve that he had brought with him. Fourth, the question of why someone does this. Why Marcus specifically, and why more broadly the category of person who plans and executes these kinds of undertakings. The easy answer is ego, and it is not a wrong answer in every case. There are people who move through wild places primarily for the story it produces afterward, for the identity it confers, for the social currency it generates in the communities they inhabit. This is real, and it is worth acknowledging because it is not a trivial motivation, and it is not always a corrupting one. The desire to be the kind of person who has done hard things can drive genuine achievement, even when it is mixed with less admirable impulses. But Marcus's account of why he wanted to cross that particular piece of Botswana, in that particular way, does not read like ego. It reads like hunger. A specific appetite for a specific kind of experience that he had learned, over 20 years of long-distance running, could only be produced by a specific set of conditions. Sustained physical effort, real wild landscape, real consequence, absence of digital mediation, sufficient duration for the recalibration of perception to occur. He had constructed the crossing as carefully as possible to produce those conditions, and it had worked. It had produced exactly what he was looking for, and a few things he was not looking for, and the combination was the thing that mattered. He said afterward that the Leopard had been the most important part of the crossing. Not the distance, not the landscape, not the physical challenge, though all of those were real and significant. The Leopard, those hours on the bank, because they had stripped away the last layer of the assumption that he was the main character of the story he was moving through. He was an animal among animals in a landscape that was not his. He could move through it with care and skill and preparation and still be, at any moment, simply a body in a place where other bodies, larger and faster and more suited to the darkness, had prior claim. That recognition, he said, was the freest he had ever felt. It sounds like a paradox, freedom produced by the recognition of powerlessness. But it is not actually paradoxical if you understand what kind of freedom he is describing. Not freedom from limitation, but freedom from the particular burden of believing yourself to be at the center of things. The ego weight of being the protagonist. When you are lying still on a bank in the African darkness listening to a leopard moving 30 meters below you, there is no room left for that particular weight. It falls away. What remains is the sensation of being alive, specific and clear, without the usual commentary. This is what wild places can give, and what is genuinely difficult to find anywhere else. The Okavango Delta, where Marcus's route had taken him through one section, is one of the most extraordinary ecosystems on Earth. It is an inland delta, which is itself a geographic peculiarity. The Okavango River, flowing from the Angolan highlands, empties not into any ocean or sea, but into the Kalahari Desert, spreading into a vast network of channels and islands and floodplains that shift and change from season to season as the flood pulse moves through. The delta expands in the dry season, paradoxically, because the rains that feed it fall far to the north and the flood arrives in Botswana months after the rains have passed. The result is a system of extraordinary productivity in the middle of a dry landscape. The animals that concentrate in and around the delta during the dry season come from